Blood and power, these were the twin obsessions that defined Henry VIII's reign, as his swollen body lay rotting from within during those final winter days of 1547. England's most notorious king faced his mortality with the same ruthless calculation that had seen him execute 2 wives and countless enemies. "The lion is dying," whispered courtiers behind closed doors, but his claws remained sharp until the end. The journey to this grotesque finale began decades earlier with a handsome athletic prince, renowned across Europe for his vigor and charm. How did this Renaissance golden boy transform into the monstrous tyrant gasping for breath in the candlelit chambers of Whitehall Palace? The answer lies not just in his infamous marriages, but in a series of medical catastrophes that would twist both his body and mind beyond recognition. By January 1547, Henry was barely recognizable as the man who had once jousted with the finest knights in Christendom. His body had become a battlefield of afflictions, his legs riddled with suppurating ulcers that emitted an odor so foul that courtiers struggled not to vomit in his presence. The king now required mechanical devices to move his enormous bulk, which some accounts suggest had expanded to nearly 400 pounds. His once handsome face had grown distorted and bloated, the eyes sunken deep into flesh that had taken on a sickly yellow hue. The royal physicians had exhausted their limited arsenal of remedies. Bloodletting herbal concoctions and prayers all proved futile against the cocktail of ailments consuming their sovereign. Most modern historians believe Henry suffered from type 2 diabetes, gout, and possibly osteomyelitis, a painful bone infection that would explain the chronic agony in his legs. More troubling was the king's mental deterioration. His legendary temper had worsened into explosive rage, episodes interspersed with periods of confused lethargy. Yet, even as death approached, the politics of succession consumed the royal court. The king's third wife, Jane Seymour, had finally provided him with a male heir, the frail 9-year-old Edward, but powerful factions were already positioning themselves to control the boy after Henry's death. The conservative Catholic faction, led by the Duke of Norfolk, competed against the reformist Protestants under Edward Seymour, the young prince. His uncle Henry, paranoid to the end, was acutely aware of these machinations, signing execution orders even as he struggled to hold a pen. The king's rapidly declining health remained one of the most closely guarded secrets in the realm. Royal proclamations continued to describe Henry as hale and hearty, while reality told a far different story. Those permitted into the royal sick room encountered a macabre scene: the immense royal bed draped in dark fabrics, the sickly sweet smell of decay barely masked by burning incense, and at the center, a mountainous form of a man who had once symbolized the vigor of England itself. Palace workers whispered of hearing the king's screams echoing through the stone corridors of Whitehall. Henry's leg ulcers caused him such excruciating pain that even the slightest movement could trigger paroxysms of agony. His physicians applied poultices containing everything from boiled onions to powdered human skull, desperate remedies that only added to his suffering. More effective was the liberal application of opium, which dulled the king's pain, but further clouded his already deteriorating mind. The psychological torment matched the physical. Henry had once been the most feared man in England, his word literally life or death for any subject. Now he found himself helpless against the betrayal of his own flesh. Court records indicate increasingly erratic behavior, moments of near delirium, when he would ramble about the ghosts of executed rivals or call out for wives long dead, and more lucid periods. The king obsessively reviewed his will, determined to control the future of his dynasty even beyond the grave. The turning point in this descent from Renaissance prince to grotesque invalid can be traced to a single catastrophic moment more than a decade earlier, in January 1536. At a tournament at Greenwich Palace, Henry, then in his mid-40s, but still clinging to the athletic prowess of his youth, took a heavy fall from his armored horse. The horse, also clad in steel, then fell on top of him. The king was knocked unconscious for 2 full hours, a period during which his court believed he was dead. The shock of the incident was so profound that it was rumored to have caused his then-wife, Anne Boleyn, to miscarry the male heir he so desperately craved. But the immediate terror of his apparent death was soon replaced by a far more insidious and enduring consequence. The fall severely aggravated a pre-existing leg injury, likely from an earlier jousting accident. This time, the wound refused to heal. It festered, developing into a chronic, suppurating varicose ulcer, a running sore that would plague him with unrelenting pain for the rest of his life. This was the wound that would ultimately bring the great king to his knees. It became the focal point of his physical decay, a constant foul-smelling source of infection that slowly poisoned his entire system. The pain was agonizing and perpetual, transforming his temperament from merely volatile to truly monstrous. The active, athletic king was gone forever, replaced by an increasingly immobile invalid whose world shrank to the confines of his palaces and, eventually, his own bedchamber. The jousting accident did more than just cripple his body. It crippled his self-image. Henry's identity was intrinsically linked to his physical strength, his martial skill, and his virility. To be reduced to a limping, pain-racked man was a profound psychological blow. He compensated for this loss of physical dominance with an escalation of political cruelty. His paranoia, always a feature of his character, now metastasized, nurtured by the constant agony and the enforced inactivity. He saw plots and conspiracies everywhere, and his response became ever more brutal. It is no coincidence that the most tyrannical phase of his reign, marked by the dissolution of the monasteries, the savage, suppression of the pilgrimage of grace, and a relentless series of high-profile executions, began in the years immediately following this accident. The pain was a constant companion, a dark whisper in his ear, fueling his rages and hardening his heart against any plea for mercy. His leg became a symbol of his own mortality, a festering reminder of the weakness he so despised, and he projected that loathing outward, onto his court, his kingdom, and his enemies. The once golden prince was now on an inexorable path to becoming the bloated, bedridden tyrant of his final days. His decline set in motion, not by a queen's failure or a courtier's plot, but by the simple brutal physics of a fall from a horse. The chronic, unyielding pain that emanated from Henry's ulcerous legs became the central, defining reality of his existence, a malevolent force that systematically reshaped his personality from the inside out. To understand the tyranny of Henry's later years, one must first understand the psychology of unrelenting agony. For a man like Henry, whose entire identity was built on a foundation of physical dominance and indomitable will, the experience of being betrayed by his own body was a unique and profound form of torture. The pain was not an occasional visitor. It was a permanent resident in the palace of his flesh. It dictated his moods, limited his movements, and colored his every interaction. The king's legendary temper, once a tool of political intimidation, now became an uncontrollable symptom of his suffering. Courtiers learned to dread the days when the pain was at its worst. On these days, the king's roars of frustration and agony would echo through the corridors of his palaces. The slightest annoyance, a misplaced document, or an unwelcome opinion could trigger explosive fits of rage that left even his most senior advisors trembling. This was not the calculated anger of a strategic monarch. It was the desperate, lashing out of a caged and wounded animal. His physicians, powerless to cure the underlying condition, could only offer palliative measures that were often as torturous as the ailment itself. They would lance the ulcers to relieve the pressure, a procedure of excruciating pain performed without anesthetic, which offered only temporary relief before the sores inevitably refilled with pus. This cycle of agony and fleeting respite created a psychological landscape of perpetual crisis. His world became a battleground between his iron will and his failing body, and it was a war he was destined to lose. This internal struggle had devastating external consequences. His judgment became clouded, his paranoia amplified. He trusted no one. The constant pain fed his belief that he was surrounded by enemies, that his courtiers were whispering behind his back, mocking his weakness. This deep-seated insecurity fueled some of the most brutal acts of his reign. The suppression of the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1537, a massive popular uprising against his religious reforms, was carried out with a level of savagery that shocked even his contemporaries. Henry's personal orders were for a merciless retribution, a clear reflection of a man who, tormented by his own physical pain, had lost the capacity for empathy and was determined to inflict his suffering on the world. His pain made him a monster, not because it was an excuse for his cruelty, but because it became the lens through which he viewed his kingdom. Every challenge to his authority was perceived as a personal attack. Every whisper of dissent a confirmation of his deepest fears. The festering wound on his leg became a physical manifestation of the corruption he saw all around him, and he sought to purge the body politic with the same desperate, brutal violence that his physicians were inflicting upon his own flesh. As the years wore on, Henry VIII's body became a grotesque monument to excess and decay, a walking testament to the corrupting influence of absolute power and unrestrained appetite. The athletic prince, who had once been celebrated for his physique, transformed into a figure of monstrous proportions. His weight ballooned to an estimated 400 pounds, with a waist measurement that exceeded 54 inches. His once handsome features were subsumed by bloated, sallow flesh, his eyes sinking into his face like small, suspicious stones. His mobility all but vanished. Walking became an agonizing ordeal, and eventually an impossibility. The king who had once danced for hours and tirelessly hunted on horseback was now a prisoner in his own immense body. To move his enormous bulk, even short distances, from his bed to his chair, required the use of elaborate mechanical devices, winches and hoists that were the cutting edge of Tudor engineering, designed not for construction, but for the sole purpose of moving the living mountain that was the King of England. Courtiers would have witnessed the humiliating spectacle of their sovereign being craned about his chambers, a process that underscored his utter dependency and physical helplessness. This physical decline was fueled by a sybaritic and frankly suicidal diet. While his ability to exercise vanished, his legendary appetite did not. The royal kitchens continued to produce staggering quantities of food, primarily vast amounts of roasted red meat and ale. A typical meal for the king might include swan, peacock, venison, and beef, all washed down with gallons of strong wine and ale. Vegetables and fruits, seen as the food of the poor, were largely absent. This diet, a cardiologist's nightmare, would have massively exacerbated his underlying conditions, contributing to his obesity, probable type 2 diabetes, and gout. His body became a living symbol of his reign, bloated, overextended, and rotting from within. The contrast between this reality and his official image was stark and deliberately maintained. The court painter, Hans Holbein the Younger, had created the enduring propaganda image of Henry, the broad-shouldered, powerful monarch, legs planted firmly apart in a posture of unshakable authority. This was the image the world was meant to see. But the reality within the palace walls was one of putrescence and decay. The magnificent tapestries and gilded decorations of his palaces served as a beautiful frame for a picture of profound human ruin. The courtiers in their silks and velvets had to navigate their daily lives around the slow agonizing, an increasingly repulsive decay of the man at the center of their universe, a sun that was collapsing into a black hole of disease and suffering. The most infamous and socially isolating aspect of Henry's physical decline was the overpowering and nauseating stench that emanated from his body. The chronic suppurating ulcers on his legs were not clean wounds. They were open, festering sores, constantly weeping pus and necrotic fluid. The smell of rotting flesh became a permanent feature of the king's private chambers, a foul miasma that defied all attempts to conceal it. Courtiers who sought an audience with the king had to first steel themselves against this olfactory assault. Accounts from the period, though discreet, paint a vivid picture. Ambassadors and nobles would hold perfumed handkerchiefs, pomanders filled with fragrant spices like cloves and ambergris, to their noses as they approached the royal presence. This was not merely an affectation of courtly life. It was a practical necessity to avoid gagging or vomiting in front of the monarch, an offense that could have serious consequences. The smell was a constant, humiliating reminder of the king's decay, a truth that could not be hidden by fine clothes or grand titles. It announced his sickness before he was even seen. The palace servants had the unenviable task of dealing with the source of the stench. The king's linen bandages had to be changed multiple times a day, a gruesome procedure that involved cleaning the weeping sores and applying fresh poultices. These discarded bandages, soaked in pus and blood, had to be carefully and secretly disposed of, often by burning them, lest they fall into the wrong hands and become relics of the king's weakness. The royal chambers themselves were in a constant battle against the smell. Expensive incense was burned day and night. The floors were strewn with fragrant herbs like lavender and meadowsweet, their pleasant aromas crushed underfoot to release their scent and combat the odor of putrefaction. Windows were often flung open, even in the dead of winter, in a desperate attempt to air out the rooms where the king sat, a living source of decay. This repulsive physical reality had a profound psychological impact, both on Henry and on those around him. For the king, it was the ultimate indignity. The man who commanded a kingdom could not command the scent of his own body. It deepened his isolation, creating a physical barrier of revulsion between him and the rest of the world. For his courtiers, it was a test of their ambition and their stomachs. Their ability to stand in the king's presence, to smile and converse while breathing in the smell of his rotting flesh, became a grim measure of their sycophancy and their resolve. The very air around the throne of England had become toxic, thick with the stench of a power that was literally and figuratively putrefying. Henry VIII's final years were a living nightmare, not just for him, but for the team of royal physicians charged with his care. They were trapped in an impossible position, commanded to heal a monarch whose conditions were incurable by the standards of their time, and fully aware that failure could be interpreted as incompetence or, even worse, treason. Their medical arsenal was a desperate and often gruesome collection of remedies drawn from classical tradition, folklore, and sheer guesswork. They were fighting a multi-front war against Henry's obesity, gout, diabetes, and the relentless infection in his legs, armed with little more than theories and hope. The primary treatment for his ulcerous legs involved a macabre cycle of lancing and poulticing. Physicians would use a sharp blade to open the swollen, inflamed sores to release the buildup of evil humors, what we would now call pus. This procedure, performed without any form of anesthetic, would have caused the king unimaginable agony, followed by a brief period of relief. Then came the application of poultices, thick pastes designed to draw out infection and promote healing. The ingredients of these concoctions sound like a witch's brew: boiled onions, lily roots, lead compounds, and even, according to some sources, powdered human skull, a substance believed to have powerful curative properties. These desperate remedies likely did more harm than good, often introducing new bacteria into the open wounds and exacerbating the infection. Bloodletting was another standard and deeply misguided treatment. Believing that the king's ailments were caused by an imbalance of the four humors, his doctors would regularly open a vein to drain what they considered an excess of blood, further weakening the already ailing monarch. For his gout, they prescribed diets that were as ineffective as they were unpleasant, and for his general malaise, they concocted potions from ground gemstones and gold, believing that these precious materials could transfer their incorruptible nature to the king's decaying body. Faced with the king's unrelenting pain, the physicians turned to the most potent painkiller available to them, opium. Administered as a liquid tincture called laudanum, it was highly effective at dulling the king's physical agony. However, it came at a steep price. Opium is a powerful narcotic that clouds the mind, induces lethargy, and can cause confusion and paranoia. The liberal use of laudanum in Henry's final years almost certainly contributed to his mental deterioration. His infamous rages, interspersed with periods of stupor and confused mumbling, are classic symptoms of heavy opiate use. His physicians were thus caught in a terrible bind. They could leave the king in clear, excruciating pain, or they could medicate him into a state of semi-coherent, paranoid confusion. It was a choice between a screaming tyrant and a rambling one. Their frantic and ultimately futile efforts paint a vivid picture of the limitations of Tudor medicine when faced with the complex, systemic failures of a body like Henry's. They were men of science, the best of their time, but in the face of their king's spectacular decay, their science was revealed to be little more than ritualized guesswork, and they were reduced to the role of helpless witnesses to a slow, agonizing, and unstoppable medical catastrophe. In the final turbulent years of Henry VIII's reign, the role of his sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr, was one of almost unimaginable difficulty and danger. She was not just a queen consort. She was, by necessity, the chief nurse to a volatile, pain-racked, and deeply paranoid tyrant. Her position required a delicate and constantly shifting blend of wifely devotion, political savvy, and the steady nerve of a battlefield medic. Catherine, a mature and twice-widowed woman when she married the king in 1543, was chosen not for passion or for her childbearing potential, but for her calm, companionable nature. Henry, in his decline, needed a comforting presence, a woman who could manage his increasingly erratic moods and tend to his decaying body. Catherine fulfilled this role with remarkable grace and courage. She personally dressed the king's foul-smelling leg ulcers, a task that would have repulsed most people, but which she undertook as part of her wifely duty. She engaged him in conversation, read to him, and debated theology with him, providing intellectual and emotional comfort that was in short supply at his court. However, her life was a daily walk on a knife's edge. Her every word and action were scrutinized by competing court factions. The very qualities that made her a good companion for the king, her intelligence and her strong, reformist Protestant faith, also made her a target for the conservative faction at court, led by the cunning Bishop Stephen Gardiner. They saw her influence over the king as a threat to their own power and to the future of the Catholic traditions that Henry still maintained. In 1546, they saw their chance to destroy her. Sensing the king's growing frustration with religious arguments, Gardiner and his allies began to poison his mind against Catherine. They presented her intellectual debates with him, not as loving conversation, but as impertinent lecturing. They accused her of heresy, a charge that had already sent Henry's fifth wife, Catherine Howard, to the executioner's block. The paranoid king, his judgment clouded by pain and opium, listened. He was persuaded that his own wife, the woman who tended his wounds, was a dangerous heretic. In a secret meeting, he authorized his counselors to draw up an arrest warrant for the queen. Catherine's situation was desperate. She was to be arrested, taken to the Tower, interrogated, and almost certainly executed. She had been betrayed by the very man she had dedicated herself to comforting. But Catherine Parr was a survivor. She was warned of the plot, likely by a sympathetic physician. Instead of panicking or fleeing, she orchestrated a brilliant and daring countermove. She went to the king, feigning illness and distress. When he confronted her about her religious views, she did not argue. Instead, she performed a masterclass in calculated submission. She told him that she only debated with him to distract him from his pain and to learn from his great wisdom. She presented herself as a humble, foolish woman, utterly subservient to her husband's superior intellect. This performance of feminine humility was perfectly calibrated to soothe Henry's massive and fragile ego. He was completely won over. "Is it so, sweetheart?" he reportedly said. "Then we are friends again." The next day, when the Lord Chancellor arrived with a guard to arrest the Queen in the palace garden, Henry flew into a rage, berating the Chancellor as a knave and a fool, and sending him away in disgrace. Catherine had not only saved her own life, she had utterly humiliated her enemies. She had stared into the abyss of Henry's tyranny, and, through a combination of intelligence, courage, and a deep understanding of her husband's psychology, she had survived. She would go on to outlive the king, a rare and remarkable achievement for a wife of Henry VIII. As Henry VIII's body continued its slow, inexorable collapse, the court around him transformed into a tense, whispering theater of political ambition. The king's physical decline created a dangerous power vacuum, and into this void rushed the competing factions of his council, each positioning themselves for the inevitable struggle that would follow his death. The air at court was thick with intrigue, a lethal game of chess being played around the sickbed of the dying monarch. The two main factions were sharply divided by religion and ambition. On one side stood the conservatives, the champions of the old Catholic ways, led by the formidable Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk, and the cunning Bishop Stephen Gardiner. They were men who had navigated the treacherous waters of Henry's court for decades, and they sought to preserve the Catholic doctrines that remained within the Henrician Church, and most importantly, to secure their own power in the next reign. They viewed the rise of Protestantism with alarm and saw the young Prince Edward as a blank slate upon which they could reinscribe the old faith. Opposing them was the new ascendant reformist faction, the champions of a more radical Protestantism. Their leaders were the ambitious and calculating Seymour brothers, Edward and Thomas. Their power stemmed from a crucial biological fact. They were the uncles of the heir to the throne, Prince Edward, their sister having been Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour. They were allied with other key Protestants, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, and Catherine Parr, the Queen herself. They saw Henry's death as a golden opportunity to push England decisively into the Protestant camp and to place themselves at the head of a new regency government. The dying king, even in his moments of delirium, was acutely aware of this circling of sharks. His paranoia, always a potent force, was now fueled by the very real prospect of his life's work being undone the moment he drew his last breath. He clung to power with a desperate grip, using his remaining authority to play the factions against each other, a familiar and deadly game he had mastered over his long reign. The court became a place of whispers, secret alliances, and sudden betrayals. A friendly conversation could be a trap, a shared drink, a test of loyalty. Courtiers had to choose their allegiance carefully, knowing that backing the wrong faction could lead to ruin or even the executioner on his block once the old king was gone. The prize in this silent, vicious war was nothing less than the future of England, its religion, its foreign policy, and its vast wealth, much of it freshly plundered from the dissolved monasteries. The fate of the nation was being decided not in a council chamber, but in the hushed, perfumed corridors outside the foul-smelling sick-room of a dying tyrant, where ambition and fear walked hand in hand. In the twilight of his reign, with his body failing and his mind clouded by pain and paranoia, Henry VIII was consumed by one single overriding obsession: securing the Tudor succession. After decades of marital turmoil, theological revolution, and ruthless purges, all in the quest for a male heir, he had finally succeeded. His third wife, Jane Seymour, had given him a son, Edward. But this triumph was fragile. Edward was still just a child, and Henry, more than anyone, knew how quickly a boy king could be manipulated or overthrown by ambitious nobles. The king's final years were dedicated to a desperate attempt to control the future from beyond the grave, to forge a chain of command so strong that it could withstand the political storms he knew his death would unleash. The primary instrument of this posthumous control was his will. Henry spent countless hours in his last months meticulously drafting and redrafting this crucial document. It was not merely a set of bequests. It was a constitutional blueprint for the next 2 decades of English governance. With painstaking detail, he laid out the line of succession. First, the crown would pass to his son, Edward, and his heirs. If Edward's line failed, it was to pass to his elder daughter, Mary, the child of Catherine of Aragon, and her heirs. And if Mary's line also failed, it would go to his younger daughter, Elizabeth, the child of the executed Anne Boleyn. This inclusion of his 2 daughters, both of whom he had previously declared illegitimate, was a remarkable and pragmatic act. It demonstrated Henry's ultimate priority, the preservation of the Tudor bloodline on the throne, even if it meant restoring the rights of the very children he had once so cruelly cast aside. To govern during his son's minority, Henry devised what he believed was a foolproof plan. He established a regency council of 16 executors, a collective of carefully balanced interests. He deliberately avoided naming a single Lord Protector, fearing that one man with supreme power would inevitably become a threat to his son. The council was to be a committee of equals, composed of both reformist and conservative members, forcing them to govern by consensus. It was a clever design, born of a deep and cynical understanding of human ambition. He was attempting to create a system of mutually assured suspicion, believing that the councilors' jealousy of one another would prevent any single one from seizing absolute control. This document was the culmination of his life's work, his final, desperate gamble to ensure that the name of Tudor would rule England for generations to come. He signed it with a trembling hand, believing he had forged an unbreakable political machine. It was a testament to his indomitable will, but it was also a testament to his ultimate naivety about the nature of power. He failed to grasp that a dead king's will, no matter how carefully crafted, is merely a piece of paper, easily torn to shreds by the ambitions of living men. From his foul-smelling deathbed in the final dark months of 1546, Henry VIII unleashed one last, savage political purge. The victims were the Howards, one of the most ancient and powerful noble families in England, and the leaders of the conservative faction at court. The patriarch was the formidable Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk, a man who had survived decades of treacherous Tudor politics. His son was the brilliant, arrogant, and reckless Henry Howard, Earl of Surrey, a celebrated poet and soldier. Their fall was a chilling demonstration of the dying king's enduring ruthlessness and the clinical efficiency of their enemies in the reformist faction. The Seymours and their allies saw the Howards as the single greatest threat to their planned takeover of the government upon Henry's death. They began to build a case against them, feeding the king's paranoid fears. The Earl of Surrey provided the perfect pretext. Arrogant and politically naive, Surrey had foolishly and illegally quartered the royal arms of Edward the Confessor with his own coat of arms. In the paranoid atmosphere of the Tudor court, this was no minor heraldic faux pas. It was interpreted as a brazen statement of his family's royal ambitions, a visual claim to the throne itself. He was accused of plotting to make his father, the Duke of Norfolk, regent for the young Prince Edward, and perhaps even to place his own family on the throne. The evidence was flimsy, based on gossip and forced testimony, but it was enough for the dying, suspicious king. In December 1546, both Norfolk and Surrey were arrested and sent to the Tower of London. The legal process that followed was a sham, a swift and brutal show trial designed to eliminate a political threat. The Earl of Surrey, defiant and proud, was tried first. He defended himself with eloquence and courage, but the verdict was a foregone conclusion. He was found guilty of treason, and on January 19, 1547, he was taken to Tower Hill and beheaded. The poet's voice was silenced forever. The Duke of Norfolk's fate was to be even more significant. As a peer of the realm, he could not be executed without an act of attainder passed by Parliament. The dying king, with grim determination, pushed the bill through. The date for Norfolk's execution was set for the morning of January 28th. The old duke, who had faithfully served Henry for decades, prepared himself for the block. But in a final dramatic twist of fate, the king himself cheated the executioner. Henry VIII died in the early hours of that very morning. The Privy Council, now under the control of the Seymours, had no desire to create a powerful Catholic martyr. They quietly canceled the execution. The Duke of Norfolk, who had been just hours from death, was left to languish in the Tower, his life spared by the timely death of the man who had condemned him. The last purge was a chilling success for the reformist faction. With the Howards eliminated, their path to power was clear. It was a final, bloody testament to the political reality of Henry Escourt. Even as the king's body rotted away, the political machine he had created continued to operate with lethal precision, consuming its own until the very last moment. The Christmas season of 1546 at the court of Henry VIII was a macabre and surreal spectacle. On the surface, the traditional festivities unfolded with all their customary pomp and grandeur. The halls of Greenwich Palace were decked with holly and ivy, great fires roared in the hearths, and the tables of the nobility groaned under the weight of festive banquets. There was music, dancing, and the elaborate exchange of New Year's gifts, a performance of cheerfulness and stability for the benefit of foreign ambassadors and the kingdom at large. But beneath this glittering, brittle facade of merriment lay a palpable and pervasive atmosphere of dread and decay. The heart of the celebration, the king himself, was a dying man. Henry made a few brief public appearances, his enormous bloated frame carried in a chair, his face a sallow mask of pain. These carefully stage-managed appearances were designed to project an image of enduring royal authority, but they did little to quell the whispers and the fearful speculation. The courtiers went through the motions of revelry, their laughter forced, their eyes constantly glancing towards the king's chambers, trying to gauge the true state of his health. Every courtier knew that the future of England and their own personal fortunes hung by the thinnest of threads, the faltering heartbeat of the man in the royal sick-room. The tension was electric. The rival factions, the Seymours and the Howards, circled each other warily, their forced smiles at the feasting table barely concealing their lethal intent. The arrest of Norfolk and Surrey just before the holidays had cast a dark shadow over the proceedings. Everyone knew a final bloody power play was underway. The festive music could not drown out the sharpening of political knives. The true drama of that Christmas was not taking place in the Great Hall, but in the hushed, anxious corridors of power. The forced jollity of the season stood in grotesque contrast to the reality of the king's condition. While the court feasted on roasted swan, Henry was likely struggling to digest a meager broth. While they drank spiced wine, he was being administered opium to dull the agonizing pain in his legs. The entire court was engaged in a collective act of denial, a desperate pantomime of normalcy, while the center of their world was visibly and olfactorily collapsing. This was to be the last Christmas of the great King Henry VIII, a feast of death, a carnival of fear, where the glitter of the decorations only served to highlight the darkness of the encroaching shadows. It was the final, hollow performance of a reign that had begun with so much promise and was now ending in a miasma of sickness, paranoia, and decay. In his final weeks, Henry VIII's formidable mind, once one of the sharpest in Europe, began to collapse under the combined assault of chronic pain, systemic infection, and heavy doses of opiate painkillers. The line between lucidity and delirium blurred, and the king, who had terrorized his kingdom for decades, became a prisoner of his own internal torments. His behavior grew increasingly erratic. There were long periods of stupor, where he would lie in his great bed, staring blankly at the tapestries, his mind seemingly vacant. These would be punctuated by sudden, terrifying fits of rage, often directed at his physicians and attendants, whom he would curse for failing to halt his decay. But perhaps most disturbing for those who witnessed it were the moments of paranoid delusion and hallucinatory terror. The ghosts of his long and bloody reign began to gather at his bedside. Courtiers and servants whispered of hearing the king cry out in the night, his voice filled with a terror that no earthly enemy had ever been able to inspire in him. He would ramble, his words a confused jumble about the enemies he had destroyed, his voice a mixture of triumph and fear. He was heard to call out the names of the wives he had executed, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, as if they were standing in the room with him. In his more lucid moments, his terror was directed not at phantoms, but at the living. His paranoia, which had been a defining feature of his personality, now became all-consuming. He saw plots and conspiracies in every shadow. He accused his most loyal servants of trying to poison him. He would demand that his food be tasted multiple times, convinced that his enemies were trying to hasten his end. This mental collapse was a source of both pity and fear for his attendants. To see the man who had held the power of life and death over millions reduced to a terrified, rambling invalid was a sobering spectacle. Yet his power, even in its diminished state, remained lethal. A confused word from the king, a paranoid accusation mumbled in a moment of delirium, could still send a man to the tower. The court had to learn to navigate this treacherous new landscape, to distinguish between the king's fleeting delusions and his genuine commands. The atmosphere in the royal apartments became that of a madhouse ruled by a dying god, a place where reality itself seemed to be fraying at the edges, and the past, with all its blood and betrayal, was rising up to claim its final, terrible vengeance on the man who had created it. As his body failed and his mind fractured, Henry VIII found himself confronting the one power he could not bend to his will, God, the king who had audaciously declared himself supreme head of the Church in England, who had torn his kingdom from its ancient allegiance to Rome, now faced the terrifying prospect of his own personal judgment day. His final weeks were marked by a profound and desperate spiritual torment. His religious position had always been a complex and self-serving hybrid. He had rejected the authority of the Pope, but he had never embraced the full theological program of the Protestant Reformation. He had dissolved the monasteries and plundered their wealth, but he had also burned Protestants as heretics for denying the Catholic doctrine of the real presence in the Eucharist. He was a schismatic, a Catholic without a pope, and he had created a church in his own image. Now, on the threshold of death, this carefully constructed theological fortress began to crumble, leaving him exposed and terrified. Contemporary accounts describe a man oscillating wildly between the religious poles of his own creation. One day, he would demand the full rights of the Catholic Church, including Mass and confession, clinging to the familiar rituals of his youth as a shield against the coming darkness. He would have his chaplains read to him from Scripture, desperately seeking some assurance of salvation. The next day, he would reaffirm his own supreme headship, denouncing the Bishop of Rome and asserting the Protestant principles that justified his break with the papacy. This spiritual vacillation was not just a matter of theological confusion. It was the thrashing of a terrified soul. The man who had sent so many to their deaths for their beliefs now had to confront the sincerity of his own. The ghosts of his victims, particularly those he had executed for their faith, seemed to haunt him. The steadfast piety of men like Sir Thomas More and Bishop John Fisher, who had gone to the block rather than accept Henry's religious supremacy, must have stood in stark contrast to his own spiritual turmoil. Did he fear that they had been right? Did he worry that in breaking with Rome, he had damned not only his kingdom, but his own immortal soul? His chaplains, caught between the old faith and the new, struggled to offer him comfort. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, a secret Protestant, likely urged him to place his faith in Christ's salvation alone, while more conservative clerics would have emphasized the importance of good works and the sacraments. Henry, caught between these competing paths to heaven, seemed unable to find peace on any of them. The fear of damnation, a very real and potent concept in the 16th century, gripped him. The king who had made himself a god on earth was now just a mortal man, facing the terrifying and unavoidable judgment of the god in heaven. By the middle of January 1547, the carefully constructed facade of the king's well-being began to disintegrate completely. The decline, which had been a slow, grinding process for years, now accelerated into a final, terrifying plunge. The inner circle of the Privy Council, now firmly under the control of the reformist faction led by Edward Seymour, recognized that the end was no longer a matter of months or weeks, but of days. Their primary objective shifted from managing the king to managing the transition of power. A conspiracy of silence, already in effect, was now enforced with absolute rigor. Access to the king's private chambers became the most tightly controlled commodity in the kingdom. Only a handful of trusted physicians, attendants, and key members of the council were permitted to enter the royal sick room. This secrecy served a dual purpose. On a practical level, it was to maintain the dignity of the monarch, to shield the grotesque reality of his final decay from the wider world. The sight of the all-powerful King Henry VIII, reduced to a helpless, babbling, incontinent wreck, was a spectacle that could undermine the very mystique of monarchy itself. But the more crucial purpose was political. News of the king's imminent death, if it were to leak out prematurely, could trigger chaos. It could embolden rival claimants to the throne, spark popular unrest, or even invite foreign invasion from France or the Holy Roman Empire, who might see a moment of weakness in a kingdom about to be ruled by a 9-year-old boy. The council had to ensure that the transfer of power to the young Prince Edward was a seamless and unchallengeable fact before the world even knew the old king was dead. They were, in effect, already governing the country, making decisions and issuing orders in the name of a king who was barely conscious. The Palace of Whitehall became a fortress of secrets, its stone walls containing the explosive truth of the king's condition. The courtiers outside the inner sanctum existed in a state of suspended animation, their world filled with rumor and uncertainty. They watched the grim faces of the counselors emerging from the king's chambers, trying to read the future in their expressions. The fate of England was being decided behind a closed door, and the only sounds that escaped were the muffled whispers of physicians and the occasional, terrifying roar of a dying king. The conspiracy of silence surrounding Henry VIII's final days was a masterclass in political stage management, orchestrated primarily by the man who had the most to gain, Edward Seymour, Earl of Hertford. As the uncle of the heir, Prince Edward, Seymour knew that a smooth, controlled transition of power was essential to securing his own dominance in the coming reign. His goal was to ensure that by the time Henry's death was officially announced, his own position as the head of the new government would be an unassailable reality. The plan was executed with cold, ruthless efficiency. While the king drifted in and out of consciousness, Seymour and his allies in the reformist faction were engaged in a silent coup. They controlled the flow of all information. They decided who could see the king and, more importantly, who could not. Key conservative rivals, like Bishop Gardiner, found themselves mysteriously denied access to the royal presence, effectively cut off from the center of power at the most critical moment. They controlled the king's dry stamp, a facsimile of his signature used to authorize official documents. This gave them the power to issue proclamations and sign arrest warrants in the name of a king who was no longer capable of making such decisions. The final purge of the Howard family was a direct result of this control. The charges against Norfolk and Surrey were pushed forward with a speed and determination that reflected the new power dynamic. With their chief conservative rivals either executed or awaiting the block, the path for a Seymour-led regency was clear. This period of intense secrecy also allowed Seymour to consolidate his support within the council. Secret meetings were held, promises of land titles and offices were made. Alliances were forged. He was methodically subverting the very essence of Henry's will, the idea of a balanced council of equals, before the king was even dead. He was building a consensus around his own leadership, ensuring that when the moment came, the council would not govern collectively, but would instead ask him to assume the title of Lord Protector. The suppression of the news was so effective that even Henry's own children were kept in the dark about the true gravity of their father's condition. Prince Edward and Princess Elizabeth were kept at a safe distance from court, shielded from the grim reality, while their futures were being decided by their ambitious uncle. The entire English government was operating in a state of surreal limbo, officially ruled by a living king, but practically controlled by the government of the next one. It was a breathtakingly audacious power grab, a testament to Seymour's political skill and his utter ruthlessness. He was not just waiting for the old king to die. He was actively using the process of the king's dying as a tool to build his own regime. The conspiracy of silence was the cloak under which the future of England was being remade. The final, catastrophic event in the medical saga of Henry VIII occurred on the night of January 27, 1547. The king, who had been lapsing in and out of consciousness for days, suffered what contemporary accounts described as a violent seizure or convulsion. In modern medical terms, this was almost certainly a massive stroke or cerebral hemorrhage, a brain event that effectively marked the point of no return. The man who had wielded absolute, unquestioned power over a nation was now rendered utterly helpless, his body no longer his own to command. Witnesses in the sick room reported a terrifying scene. The king's enormous body was racked by violent tremors. His attendants had to physically hold him down to prevent him from injuring himself. When the seizure finally passed, the devastation was clear. The right side of his body was partially paralyzed. His ability to speak was gone. His powerful voice, which had once cowed ambassadors and condemned queens, reduced to incoherent mumbling. He was trapped inside his own ruined flesh, his mind, what was left of it, unable to communicate with the outside world. The royal physicians, faced with this final, undeniable crisis, worked with frantic desperation. They knew their own positions, and perhaps their own lives, depended on being seen to do everything possible for their royal patient. They resorted to the most extreme and brutal treatments in their limited arsenal. Hot irons or cauteries were applied to his skin, the searing pain intended to shock his system back into action. They forced bitter, foul-tasting medicinal concoctions down his throat, hoping to purge the humors that they believed had caused the attack. These were the desperate, futile actions of men confronting the absolute limit of their medical knowledge. Throughout this final ordeal, access to the royal bedchamber was more strictly controlled than ever. Only Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, the king's most trusted spiritual advisor, and a handful of the most senior members of the Seymour faction were allowed entry. The secrecy was paramount. The news that the king was not only dying, but was now effectively a paralyzed mute, would have been politically explosive. The fiction of his rule had to be maintained for just a little longer, to give Seymour the final hours he needed to cement his control. In the candlelit gloom of the sick room at Whitehall, the great king lay inert, a breathing corpse his reign over in all but name his final moments. A grotesque tableau of human frailty and the ultimate powerlessness of even the most absolute monarch. With the king paralyzed and unable to speak, the atmosphere in the royal sick room became one of hushed, solemn waiting. The political machinations were complete. All that remained was the final spiritual act. Sir Anthony Denny, one of the king's most trusted attendants and a man of reformist sympathies, took it upon himself to perform the most dangerous duty of any Tudor courtier, to inform the king that his end was near. To speak of a king's death in his presence was technically treason, but Denny, seeing the reality of the situation, bravely leaned close to the king and told him that his hope of recovery was gone, and that he should turn his thoughts to the fate of his soul. Henry, though unable to speak, was apparently lucid enough to understand. When Denny asked if he wished to see a cleric, the king reportedly whispered the name of the one man he seemed to trust above all others, Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Cranmer was urgently summoned. He had been a constant and complex figure throughout Henry's reign. A cautious and scholarly man with secret, deeply held Protestant beliefs. He had managed to survive decades of Henry's religious whims and violent purges. He had been the one to annul the king's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and he had been a key ally to Anne Boleyn. Yet he had also managed to retain the king's unwavering personal affection and trust, even when Henry was burning other Protestants for heresy. He was a master of survival, but also a man of genuine, if quiet, faith. He now faced his most difficult and poignant task, to guide the soul of the man who had been his master, his protector, and at times his tormentor, into the next world. When Cranmer arrived at the bedside, the king's life was clearly ebbing away. He was past the point of being able to make a formal confession or receive the last rites of the church. The final moments of the man who had so dramatically reshaped the religious landscape of England would be devoid of the ceremony he had so often insisted upon for others. Cranmer knelt by the great bed, the stench of sickness and decay thick in the air, and took the king's hand. He spoke to the dying monarch not of popes or sacraments, but of a simpler, more Protestant path to salvation. He urged Henry to put his full faith not in his own works or in the rituals of the church, but solely in the saving mercy of Jesus Christ. The final moments of Henry VIII's life have been shrouded in myth and propaganda, but one powerful and poignant image endures, an event that would be seized upon by Protestant chroniclers as proof of the king's final true conversion. With Henry unable to speak, his body all but lifeless, Archbishop Cranmer, kneeling at his bedside, made a final desperate plea for a sign. He asked the king that if he put his trust in the salvation offered by Christ, as he had just been urged to do, he should give him a token, a squeeze of the hand. The silence in the room would have been absolute, the handful of powerful witnesses holding their breath. Then, according to the accounts of those present, the dying king, who had been unable to move or speak, summoned the very last of his strength and squeezed the archbishop's hand. Whether this was a conscious act of faith, an involuntary muscle spasm, or simply a story embellished by those who wished to claim the king's soul for the Protestant cause, we will never truly know. But for those in the room, and for the Protestant regime that was about to take power, the meaning was clear. It was a sign. It was an affirmation. The great king, the schismatic who had hovered between two faiths, had, in his final moment of consciousness, chosen the path of the Reformation. This single simple gesture was a powerful political and theological statement. It provided the incoming Protestant government of his son with a crucial piece of propaganda, the claim that their own religious reforms were a direct continuation of the final, enlightened will of the great King Henry himself. It was a quiet, ambiguous end for a man whose life had been so loud and violent, a final whisper that would echo through the religious battles of the coming decades. The hand that had signed death warrants, broken with Rome, and wielded the scepter of absolute power had, in its final feeble gesture, given a posthumous blessing to a future that Henry himself had never fully embraced. The end finally came in the cold, dark, early hours of the morning on Friday, January 28th, 1547. With Archbishop Cranmer and a few trusted counselors keeping vigil, King Henry VIII, aged 55, drew his last, rasping breath. The man who had dominated the English stage for nearly 38 years, whose personality had shaped the destiny of a nation, was dead. The immediate reaction in the royal bedchamber was not one of grief, but of hushed, tense activity. The death of a monarch was a moment of immense political gravity, and the men present understood that their every action would be scrutinized. The first priority was to maintain the conspiracy of silence. The king's body was carefully attended to, but the news of his death was not allowed to leave the room. For 3 full days, the English government would operate under the fiction that the king was still alive, albeit gravely ill. This period was crucial for Edward Seymour and his faction. It gave them the time they needed to finalize their seizure of power, to move Prince Edward to a secure location, and to ensure that all the key levers of the state, the Tower of London, the royal treasury, the armed forces, were firmly in their hands before the public was informed of the transition. The news of the king's death was a state secret of the highest order. While Henry's corpse lay cooling in his chamber at Whitehall, a silent coup was being completed in the corridors outside. Seymour convened the Privy Council, and through a combination of persuasion, promises, and the implied threat of the power he already wielded, he convinced them to set aside the collective regency that Henry had so carefully designed in his will. Instead, the council formally petitioned Seymour to become Lord Protector of the realm and governor of the king's person, granting him near absolute authority to rule in the name of his 9-year-old nephew, the new King Edward VI. When the official announcement of Henry's death was finally made to Parliament and the public on January 31st, it was presented alongside the announcement of Seymour's new supreme title. There was no power vacuum, no uncertainty. The old king was dead, and his successor's government, led by a single powerful figure, was already firmly in place. The seamlessness of the transition was a testament to Seymour's audacious and brilliantly executed plan. He had used the king's dying days to completely subvert his dying wishes, ensuring that the new era would begin not with the balanced council Henry had envisioned, but with the quasi-royal rule of the Lord Protector. The lion was dead, and the wolf had already taken his place. Once the political necessities had been attended to, the grim and challenging task of dealing with the king's mortal remains began. The disposal of Henry VIII's corpse presented a unique and horrifying set of logistical problems for the royal household. The sheer size of the body, combined with the advanced state of infection and decay that was already present at the time of death, meant that the normal processes of decomposition began with alarming speed. The royal embalmers, the most skilled practitioners of their art in the kingdom, were faced with a task of unprecedented difficulty. Their work was not just about preservation. It was about managing a biohazard. They were reportedly shocked by the state of the king's internal organs when they performed the evisceration, noting the diseased and engorged condition of his liver and heart. They worked frantically to remove the organs, which were placed in sealed containers for separate burial, and to fill the massive body cavity with a mixture of fragrant herbs, spices, and preserving agents. This was a desperate battle against putrefaction, an attempt to make the royal corpse presentable for the period of lying in state. A special coffin had to be constructed, a gigantic lead-lined casket reportedly almost square in shape, to accommodate the king's enormous girth. Its weight was immense, requiring a reinforced bier and a team of extra pallbearers to move it. It was this lead lining, intended to seal in the corruption and contain the foul odors, that would lead to the most infamous and grotesque episode in the entire funereal process. The king's body, now sealed in its leaden prison, was to lie in state at Whitehall before being transported to Windsor for burial. It was during a rest stop on this final journey, at Sion Abbey, that the unthinkable happened. The natural process of putrefaction within the corpse produced a massive buildup of gases. The pressure inside the sealed lead coffin became immense, until it finally and catastrophically failed. The coffin burst open. According to a story recorded by a contemporary Catholic propagandist, and thus possibly embellished, but rooted in a plausible reality, the coffin split, and the king's blood and other bodily fluids began to leak out onto the floor of the chapel where it was resting overnight. In a final, horrifying indignity, a dog was said to have crept in during the night and begun to lick up the seeping gore. This macabre detail, whether literally true or not, captured a powerful symbolic truth. a prophecy made years earlier by a friar that dogs would lick the king's blood as they had licked the blood of the wicked King Ahab in the Bible had in the minds of many come to pass. It was a grotesque final judgment on a king whose life had been filled with so much blood and excess. A final undignified end that stood in stark contrast to the majesty and power he had projected throughout his reign. The public performance of Henry VIII's funeral was one of the grandest and most expensive pieces of political theater the Tudor dynasty ever staged. It was a massive multi-day spectacle designed to awe the populace, to reinforce the legitimacy of the new regime, and to project an image of continuity and unshakable power, even in the face of death. The funeral procession, which wound its way from Whitehall in London to its final destination at Windsor Castle, was a somber, magnificent river of black cloth, flickering torchlight, and heraldic display. The centerpiece of the procession was the king's massive coffin, draped in a rich cloth of gold pall. It was drawn on a chariot pulled by 8 powerful horses, each draped to the ground in black velvet and adorned with banners bearing the arms of the kingdom. But the body inside the coffin, the decaying reality of the dead king, was deliberately hidden. Atop the coffin, for all the world to see, rested a lifelike and life-sized wax effigy of Henry. This was the king as he wanted to be remembered, not as the bloated, diseased invalid he had become, but as the powerful monarch of his prime. The effigy was dressed in crimson velvet and ermine, wearing a crown on its head and holding a scepter and orb in its hands. This artificial body, forever majestic and incorruptible, served as the public focus of mourning, a powerful substitute for the horrifying reality concealed beneath it. The procession itself was a moving display of the entire Tudor hierarchy. Hundreds of nobles, clergy, and servants marched in strict order of precedence, their black mourning cloaks a stark contrast to the colorful banners that fluttered in the cold February wind. Heralds in their vibrant tabards proclaimed the king's titles, while thousands of mourners, some paid, some genuine, lined the route, their faces lit by the light of the countless torches that were carried to light the way. The journey to Windsor took several days, with the procession stopping overnight at religious houses along the route. At each stop, the effigy was treated as if it were the living king, with ceremonies and vigils held in its presence. This was more than just a funeral. It was a powerful ritual of transition. It physically demonstrated the transfer of the royal presence from the old king to the new, and it reassured the people that even though the mortal body of the king had perished, the immortal symbolic body of the monarchy endured. The sheer scale and expense of the funeral were a final defiant statement of the power and wealth of the Tudor state. A magnificent somber performance designed to bury not just a king, but the fear and uncertainty that his death had unleashed. The final resting place for the great king had been chosen by Henry himself. He was to be buried in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, the spiritual home of the Order of the Garter and a key symbol of English monarchy. But his choice of burial partner was deeply significant. He was not to be laid to rest with his first wife, the mother of his eldest child, nor with any of his other wives. He was to be interred in a vault directly beside Jane Seymour. She was the only one of his 6 wives to have given him what he craved above all else, a legitimate male heir. By dying from complications of childbirth just days after her triumph, she had also been the only one to escape the inevitable waning of Henry's affection and the potential for a fall from grace. In his mind, she was his one true, successful queen. The burial service was a magnificent and solemn affair, conducted with all the elaborate Catholic ritual that Henry, despite his break with Rome, still cherished. The chapel was draped in black, the air thick with the smoke of incense and the sound of Latin chants. Archbishop Cranmer presided, committing the king's body to the ground. As the massive coffin was slowly lowered into the vault below the chapel floor, the great officers of the royal household performed a final symbolic act of service. One by one, the Lord Chamberlain, the Treasurer, and the Controller broke their white staves of office, and cast them into the grave, signifying that their service to the old king was at an end. With a final prayer and a shower of earth, the vault was sealed. The man who had dominated England for nearly 4 decades, who had reshaped its religious and political landscape through sheer force of will, was gone. But his burial next to the mother of his heir was a final silent statement of his life's ultimate purpose. All the turmoil, all the executions, all the religious revolution had been, in his mind, for this: to secure the succession, to place a Tudor son on the throne, and to ensure that his dynasty would endure. In death, as in life, his son's mother was his chosen partner, the symbol of his one great, enduring victory. The ink on Henry VIII's will was barely dry before the political machine he had so carefully designed was systematically dismantled by the very men he had entrusted with its care. The king's grand vision of a balanced, collective regency council, a system of checks and balances born of his own deep-seated paranoia, lasted for less than a week. The reality of power proved far stronger than the written instructions of a dead monarch. Edward Seymour, now the uncle of the new boy king, moved with breathtaking speed. He had already laid the groundwork for his coup in the final days of Henry's life, and now he executed the final stage. On February 1st, just a day after the king's death was publicly announced, the executors of the will convened. Rather than assuming their roles as a council of equals, they were persuaded by Seymour and his allies to delegate their authority to him. The justification was one of efficiency and necessity. A kingdom, they argued, could not be effectively governed by a committee of 16. It needed a single, decisive leader. The members of the council who might have resisted, particularly the conservatives, were outmaneuvered. Their leaders, the Howards, were already neutralized. Others were bought off with promises of titles, lands, and a share in the spoils of power. Within days, Edward Seymour was named Lord Protector of the realm and granted quasi-royal authority to rule in his nephew's name. This act was a complete and utter subversion of Henry's will. The dead king had gone to great lengths to prevent exactly this scenario, the concentration of power in a single ambitious nobleman. But his careful planning had proven futile. He had failed to account for the simple, brutal fact that once he was gone, his fearsome presence, the ultimate enforcer of his will, was gone too. The chains of his authority, which had seemed so strong in life, proved to be remarkably brittle in death. The speed with which his wishes were discarded is a stark testament to the limitations of posthumous power. Henry had been a master of controlling living men through a mixture of fear, patronage, and charisma, but he could not control them from the grave. His will became a mere historical document, its clauses ignored, its spirit violated. The new era began not with a continuation of Henry's design, but with its immediate and decisive rejection. The carefully constructed political legacy of the great king was the first casualty of the new reign, torn apart by the raw ambition of the men he had left behind. Henry VIII's death threw the lives of his 3 children into a new and dangerous chapter. They had inherited a kingdom, but also a legacy of religious turmoil and personal vulnerability. Each of them, products of their father's tumultuous marital history, now had to navigate the treacherous political landscape he had left behind. The new king, Edward VI, was a mere 9-year-old boy. He was now the sacred sovereign of England, but in reality, he was a political pawn, the centerpiece of the new Protestant regime, controlled by his uncle, the Lord Protector, Edward Seymour. Edward was a bright and intensely pious child who had been raised by Protestant tutors to be a fervent reformer. His personal writings from the time show a chilling, almost detached seriousness. He recorded his father's death in his journal with a formal, unemotional coolness that speaks to the strange, isolated nature of his royal upbringing. He was the king, but his childhood was over, and his reign would be defined by the ambitions of the powerful men who ruled in his name. His elder sister Mary was now a mature woman of 31. The daughter of the staunchly Catholic Catherine of Aragon, she had endured years of humiliation and persecution under her father. She had been declared a bastard, stripped of her title of princess, and forced to serve as a lady-in-waiting to her infant half-sister Elizabeth. She had clung to her Catholic faith with a fierce, unyielding determination, seeing it as a link to her deposed mother and the true pre-schismatic order of the world. Her father's death brought a measure of personal freedom, but it also placed her in a position of increased danger. As the heir to the throne after Edward, she was the great hope of England's remaining Catholics and a living symbol of opposition to the new, radical Protestantism of her brother's government. She became a focus of conservative dissent, an isolated, defiant figure in a court that was rapidly moving in a direction she found abhorrent. The youngest, Elizabeth, was just 13. The daughter of the executed Anne Boleyn, she had lived her entire life in the shadow of her mother's scandalous downfall. She, too, had been declared illegitimate. Her position was perhaps the most precarious of all. As a Protestant, she was not an immediate threat to the new regime in the way Mary was, but her claim to the throne was, in the eyes of many, the most tenuous. She had learned from a very early age the necessity of caution, intelligence, and self-control. She had to navigate the complex world of the Tudor court with a wisdom far beyond her years, knowing that a single misstep, a single unguarded word, could have fatal consequences. Her father had left his children a crown, but it was a poisoned chalice, a legacy that would see them pitted against each other in the brutal religious and political struggles that were to come. The medical history of Henry VIII's final years provides one of the most fascinating and horrifying case studies in royal pathology. While the Tudor physicians, with their talk of humors and miasmas, were powerless to halt his decline, modern medical science can offer a retrospective diagnosis that paints a clearer picture of his spectacular physiological collapse. The evidence, drawn from contemporary accounts of his symptoms, points not to a single ailment, but to a cascade of interconnected chronic diseases, many of which were exacerbated by his lifestyle and his own immense ego. The most likely underlying condition was severe, uncontrolled type 2 diabetes. This would explain his massive obesity, his recurring infections, and the poor circulation that prevented his leg wounds from healing. The constant high blood sugar would have wreaked havoc on his entire system, damaging his nerves, his kidneys, and his heart. On top of this was the excruciatingly painful gout, a form of inflammatory arthritis caused by high levels of uric acid, a direct result of his meat-heavy, alcohol-rich diet. The combination of diabetic neuropathy and gout would have made his legs a source of constant, multi-layered agony. The infamous foul-smelling ulcers themselves were likely a result of chronic osteomyelitis, a deep and persistent infection of the bone, which is notoriously difficult to treat even with modern antibiotics. For the Tudor physicians, it was an impossible challenge. The infection would have periodically seeded his bloodstream, a condition known as sepsis, leading to the fevers, chills, and periods of delirium that marked his final months. This systemic infection would have placed enormous strain on his heart, likely leading to congestive heart failure, which would account for the bloating, shortness of breath, and the eventual fluid buildup that contributed to his death. Some historians have also pointed to other, more controversial, potential diagnoses. Syphilis has often been suggested, and while possible, the specific pattern of his symptoms does not align perfectly with the typical progression of the disease. A more intriguing modern theory suggests he may have suffered from a rare genetic condition called McLeod syndrome, which can cause both physical deterioration and significant psychological changes, including paranoia and erratic behavior. Another theory points to the cumulative effect of multiple head injuries from his jousting career, suggesting he may have suffered from a form of chronic traumatic encephalopathy, similar to that seen in modern athletes. which could explain his dramatic shift in personality from a charismatic youth to a tyrannical monster. Whatever the precise combination of ailments, his medical record is a stark illustration of the limitations of 16th century medicine when confronted with the complex, systemic diseases of modern lifestyles. The king had the best medical care money could buy, but all the powdered gemstones and boiled onions in the world were useless against the fundamental failures of his own body. A body he had pushed to its absolute limit through a lifetime of excess and indulgence. The enduring public image of Henry VIII is a masterpiece of political propaganda, a carefully constructed myth that stands in stark and deliberate contrast to the grotesque reality of his final years. The man we remember is not the 400-pound, bedridden invalid, reeking of decay and screaming in agony. The man we remember is the one created for us by his court painter, Hans Holbein the Younger. The iconic Holbein portrait, painted in 1537, depicts the king in the full flower of his arrogant power. He stands with his legs planted wide, his shoulders broad, his hands on his hips, his gaze direct and challenging. He is a tower of masculine strength and unshakable authority. His costume is a magnificent display of wealth and power, with jewels, silks, and cloth of gold. This is not a portrait of a man. It is a portrait of an idea, the idea of absolute monarchy, of England's defiance of foreign powers, of the virile, martial king. This image was a deliberate work of political communication. It was created at a time when Henry's physical decline was already beginning, when the leg ulcer was already a festering problem. It was an act of defiance against his own encroaching weakness, a visual declaration that the king's symbolic body, the body of the monarchy itself, was strong and powerful, regardless of the state of his mortal flesh. This powerful, sanitized image was reproduced and disseminated, becoming the official face of the Tudor regime. It was the image that hung in palaces, that was seen by foreign ambassadors, and that was intended to be seared into the consciousness of his subjects. The reality, of course, was a closely guarded secret. The humiliating truth of his physical decay, the mechanical hoists, the weeping sores, the overwhelming stench, was confined to the inner sanctum of his private chambers. The public was fed a carefully curated diet of propaganda that celebrated his strength and authority, even as that strength was visibly ebbing away. After his death, this myth-making went into overdrive. The funeral effigy, the grand procession, all of it was designed to reinforce the Holbein image. The history of his reign, written by Protestant chroniclers eager to justify the break with Rome, tended to frame him as a strong, if flawed, national hero who had liberated England from papal tyranny. The more monstrous aspects of his character and the grotesque details of his end were downplayed or ignored. This is how a myth is born. The complex, contradictory, and ultimately pathetic reality of the man was replaced by a simple, powerful, and enduring symbol. The story of Henry's final days is the story of this great divergence, the widening chasm between the man and the myth, between the decaying, suffering human being and the magnificent immortal icon he and his successors so desperately wanted the world to remember. The final, agonizing decay of Henry VIII serves as a powerful and chilling metaphor for the very nature of his reign. There is a grotesque, poetic justice in the manner of his end. The man who was obsessed with control found himself utterly unable to control his own body. The monarch whose ego was so vast it reshaped a nation's religion was brought low by microscopic bacteria. The great athlete and warrior, whose identity was founded on physical prowess, spent his last years as an immobile, helpless invalid. His body, in its spectacular collapse, became a physical manifestation of the moral and political corruption that had characterized his rule. The gluttonous appetite that led to his massive obesity mirrored the insatiable greed that led him to dissolve the monasteries and seize their immense wealth. The putrefying sores on his legs, which repulsed all who came near him, became a symbol of the moral rot at the heart of his court, a place of sycophancy, betrayal, and judicial murder. The fortress of his flesh, which had once seemed so indomitable, became a prison of pain and decay, much as the kingdom of England had become a prison for those who dared to defy his will. There is a profound and dark irony in his end. A king who had executed 2 of his wives for failing to produce a healthy male heir, a man for whom virility and lineage were everything, died a bloated, impotent wreck. A ruler who had demanded absolute obedience and projected an image of divine authority spent his final days screaming in pain and babbling in delirium, utterly dependent on the servants who had to clean and move his massive failing body. His death was the ultimate refutation of his life's core beliefs. It demonstrated, in the most visceral and unforgettable way, the absolute limitations of earthly power. He could command armies, execute nobles, and defy the Pope, but he could not command his own cells to heal. He could demand eternal loyalty, but he could not prevent the inexorable process of putrefaction. The story of his grotesque end is therefore not just a piece of historical true crime, a morbid tale of a sick king. It is a profound meditation on the nature of tyranny. It reveals that absolute power does not lead to divinity, but to a profound and monstrous isolation. Henry's power cut him off from honest counsel, from genuine human affection, and ultimately from reality itself. In the end, he was left with nothing but his pain, his paranoia, and the terrifying silence of his own conscience. His decaying body was the final terrible kingdom over which he still reigned, and it was a kingdom of pure, unrelenting horror. The death of Henry VIII was more than just the end of a man. It was the end of an era. He can be seen as the last truly medieval king to rule England, a monarch who still embodied the ancient, personal, and often brutal nature of feudal power. At the same time, he was a key transitional figure who, through his actions, inadvertently paved the way for the modern bureaucratic state. His reign was a collision of 2 worlds. His belief in his own divine right, his obsession with chivalry, and his use of the court as a direct extension of his personal household were all hallmarks of a medieval mindset. He ruled not as a chief executive, but as a patriarch, a warlord, a high priest of his own cult of personality. Yet, the very revolution he unleashed, the break with Rome and the seizure of monastic lands, required the creation of a vast new bureaucracy to manage it. The Court of Augmentations, established to handle the great transfer of wealth, was a modern, efficient administrative machine. The state papers and the archives of his reign swelled, a testament to a government that was becoming more systematic, more document-driven, and less dependent on the personal whim of the monarch. His death accelerated this transition. The government of the boy King Edward VI, led by a council and a Lord Protector, had to function without the fearsome, personal authority of Henry. It had to rely on institutions, on procedures, and on a more collective form of governance. The foundations of the modern English state, with its complex relationship between the monarch, the council, and parliament, were laid in the chaos of Henry's reign and solidified in the vacuum left by his death. Ultimately, however, the most enduring lesson from Henry's final, agonizing days is not political or medical, but existential. His story is a stark and terrifying reminder of the great and final equalizer, death. It demonstrates, more powerfully than any philosophical treatise, that no amount of wealth, power, or authority can provide an escape from the fundamental vulnerabilities of the human condition. The king who had held the power of life and death over millions found himself helpless against his own mortality. In the face of disease, decay, and the terror of divine judgment, he was no different from the humblest of his subjects. In his final, helpless moments, as he lay paralyzed and speechless, his titles and his treasures were meaningless. He was simply a dying man, facing an eternity he could no longer control. And in that ultimate powerlessness, the story of England's most infamous and tyrannical king becomes a universal one, a chilling whisper across the centuries about the vanity of human ambition and the inescapable reality of our shared mortal fate.